Thank you, everybody. Please take your seats. And thanks for joining us here. All right. Let's get a warm round of applause for David Schwartz, CTO of Ripple. All right, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Pomerantz, and I'm the session lead. I'm a second-year MBA who will be introducing David and Professor Parker. Very excited to have them both joining us today, especially for David's fireside chat. David, thank you for zooming in. Professor Parker, thank you for zooming in as well. So a very brief introduction on David. He is the CTO at Ripple. He's one of the original architects of the XRP ledger as well. And prior to Ripple, he was the CTO for Webmaster Incorporated, which was a software developer based out of Santa Clara. He's developed an encrypted cloud storage and enterprise messaging systems for companies like CNN, as well as the NSA. And he's known as Joel Katz, and he's a very respected voice in the digital currency community. David, thank you so much for joining us. And this fireside chat will be moderated by Professor Jonathan Parker. He is the head of the MIT Sloan Finance Department, and he's also the co-director at the MIT Gold Center for Finance and Policy. He's held numerous service positions, as well as illustrious consulting positions within the U.S. Department of Treasury, as well as being the area head of economics. He's an expert in finance, macro, and household behavior, and he publishes widely on a variety of topics in those fields. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Parker, to moderate.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's great to be here and a real pleasure to be here and to be able to interview David. So thank you very much. I should say that I teach two classes pretty regularly at Sloan. One is on global capital markets, and the other is on consumer finance and fintech. And Ripple is probably the only company that gets mentioned in both. So it's a pleasure to do this. So given we're at the FinTech conference here, I'd kind of like to start at the beginning, David, if I may. I'm interested broadly in the role of FinTech in breaking down sort of old profit centers and disrupting finance a little bit. And so I'm curious about the origins of Ripple, sort of the founding story and the early days of Ripple and how it was set up sort of originally largely as payments mechanism internationally. And so can you go back and tell us about the beginning of Ripple and how it got started and rose originally?
Sure. So in the very beginning, like the history of Ripple, Bitcoin had kind of just come out, and people were looking at Bitcoin as a way of sort of as a disruptive technology and potentially, essentially Bitcoin, the asset sort of taking over the world. And this was a point where there was a lot of naive optimism, particularly around the technology and around how quickly it might be adopted and the effects that it might have. And I think one of the things that, like for example, at the time, people would say things like, "Oh, proof of work was like this liberating factor, and anybody who had extra power could just like do some mining, and they could make money that way, and so that would be sort of a distributing and decentralizing force." I think we now know that that's incredibly economically naive. Someone's going to be the best at. Like it's obvious why that doesn't work. Whoever's the best at it is going to do more. Is going to drive everybody out. And the first cracks in that sort of veneer were starting to show. And I think the other problem was like the very first Bitcoin maximalists were starting their early view that like, well, people should just use Bitcoin for everything. And it's kind of like saying that you have a religion of peace if everybody believed it. Like every religion's a religion of peace if everybody believes that religion, right? There's no religion that believes that you should kill people who like, there's no religion that's like adverse to itself, right? And so what we started thinking was, first of all, even if you imagine this sort of Bitcoin maximalist world where Bitcoin takes over, well, you still have to get there, right? 99% of the world's value is in existing financial systems. And so you need to build bridges, even if you're a Bitcoin maximalist who think people are going to use Bitcoin for everything. Because if you're not, you obviously need bridges. Otherwise, what good is a new technology if it isn't connected to where the people are, where the money is, right? You rob banks. It was from his bank robber who asked why you rob banks. That's where the money is, right? You got to go to where the money is. If you try to sit somewhere and wait for the money to come to you, that won't work. But our first strategy was the same bottom-up strategy that everybody else was using, because we kind of didn't realize in the early days that we actually needed a strategy. in the beginning, we were kind of driven by what we had with the hand that we were dealt. So we started working on eliminating proof of work and coming up with something that was sort of more decentralized, faster, and something that would have bridges built in, something that could connect to existing systems. And I think we were very inspired by this sort of liberating feel of the internet. Prior to the internet, there were huge information gatekeepers. Like if you couldn't get something printed in a newspaper or on TV, you basically couldn't get it out to people. And cable access existed, but it was minor. There was no way to have information influence if you weren't part of the sort of old guard, or could you influence the old guard. And the internet changed that. It's kind of sad that recently it started backsliding, right? New information gatekeepers have emerged. And I think people are upset about that precisely because they had that. That's really a return to the way it always was, right? But once people have a taste of something that's sort of fairer and more equal access and open, that's what they want. And so that was our earliest strategy, was build a decentralized, censorship-resistant payment system focused on payments that would support multiple assets. Because even if you thought the world would eventually converge on a single global asset, they certainly need ways to get there, and they certainly aren't there now. And what's kind of interesting looking at where Ripple was and where it's almost come a little bit full circle. So we then focused almost exclusively on payments. We basically split into an enterprise payments portion and a sort of non-enterprise, sort of open source, bottom-up decentralized payments section. That's still, still Ripple has these two business units, RippleX and RippleNet. And we've kind of a little bit come full circle, because I think in the past year and a half or so, we've really started more embracing what's going on in the cryptocurrency communities in ways we haven't, particularly because of issues like climate concerns and so on that have sort of forced us to say that we don't really feel like we can sort of sit back and not participate in the ecosystem. And I think also we've been a sort of part, we've also there's what we've done ourselves, and there's also being a part of a community that's trying to accomplish a large number of different things. There are a number of other companies and foundations that are building on top of the XRP ledger. And but I still think, in my heart of hearts, I still think it all comes back to payments. I can talk more about that later, but I still think that payments are an unsolved problem. They're a huge unsolved problem, and I think we still need to get that right. They still suck.
That's great. So yeah, I think of Ripple a little bit, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, as sort of starting at a core pain point in the payment system, which was global remittances. And that first use case was, solving a bunch of that or making big strides there was a huge launch for the company. And then it's come a long way since then, obviously. Do you want to talk a little bit about just the evolution from a payments company to where it is now? I mean, you kind of closed that answer with, we're thinking payments is still our core, but you want to talk a little bit about how that journey has gone from an international payments company?
Yeah. So I mean, there's $130 trillion cross-border payments market, and the existing system. So we initially just said, let's go to these institutions and let's talk to them about using a cryptocurrency. Our very first, the way we kind of got into that is let's talk to them about using a cryptocurrency. We weren't thinking about our thought of disrupting the industry was to get them to use cryptocurrency for settlement. We thought, hey, that makes and it still does. That's still you'll hear people saying, Bitcoin could be a great means of international settlement, and they're right. And so we talked to these institutions and we said, hey, how about using a digital asset for settlement? And what we ran into was technology that's 40 years old throughout the system, or worse. You log into your bank's website, or they have an app, and it's all glitzy and nice. Everything looks fantastic. You drag things around, and it's all nice. And then you go one or two layers down, and it's you got into a time machine, right? And you wake up, if you're lucky, in the 70s. We have settlement based on old reel-to-reel machines where they couldn't settle in real time because if the reel that had your transaction was on the bank system, it couldn't be on the system that communicated to other banks, because that was a physically separate machine that someone had to carry a reel of tape from. So they said, there's no way. For example, they said, when we make a payment, we don't even know the path the money's going to take. We don't know how much the fees are going to be. So there's just no way that we could settle at that time, because we don't know how much we need to settle for. And we're like, ugh. We face palmed, and we said, okay, I guess we have to rebuild the plumbing. We have to rebuild the lowest layer. And I have to say, that is still an inspiring idea to me. one of the things that I found so inspiring about Bitcoin was this idea that don't build on the incumbent systems and the existing systems that are legacy and decades old and that enrich other people who are heavily invested in them. Like use the technologies from the bottom up that are the most suited to the problem, that are modern, that are, like, for example, like most of the existing payments infrastructure is based on cryptography that predates public key cryptography. Like the thing that secures everything on the internet, the thing that like enables you to not have to worry. Like I can access Amazon and know I'm talking Amazon without having to have without having to have a password that Amazon and I share. Like the whole security infrastructure didn't exist in the payment system. And so they said like, there's no way we can settle with the cryptocurrency with the software we have. Like you're gonna have to Swift. It's not like Swift is making a whole bunch of money, right? Swift is basically almost like a money neutral thing. It's not like we wanted to take over this lucrative business. We just needed we needed things to work better in order for us to like get people to use a cryptocurrency for payment. And so we built this system, RippleNet. And we looked at all the problems there. We brought the failure rate down. We brought the settlement time down. Even it's crazy, but end-to-end messaging prior to a payment is revolutionary, which is it's ridiculous. Like you go to a bank and you tell them you want to make an international payment. You tell them, how much is this going to cost me? Oh, we don't know. How much money is going to be delivered? Oh, we don't know, because there's no messaging, right? The money is just sort of pushed down a pipe and eventually something will come out the other side. And a significant fraction of payments that don't fail still the customer calls to check on the payment because they don't know, because they'll tell you it takes 3 to 6 business days. So when do you call them? I mean, it's just, so we kind of wound up having to fix like the whole payments infrastructure. And I think we built RippleNet, which is a genuinely like better payment technology. We have the XRP ledger, which I think is a genuinely better payment technology. And, there's this saying, like, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. Well, we got 2 better mousetraps, where payments are still awful. So I think, we have the technology to allow every financial institution on the planet to settle with every other financial institution in a compatible jurisdiction in any asset in seconds for less than a penny. Just think about this. Anyone who's made a payment knows that we're nowhere near that today. But imagine every financial institution settling with every other financial institution in seconds for less than a penny, any asset. That's fundamentally transformative. We have the technology to do it. Now we just need to figure out how to drive the adoption. And of course, there's all the challenges there's incumbents, there's regulation, there's inertia, there's the there's big players who are really trying to defend, if you're one of the largest banks in the world, you want to push pause or stop on technology. Because you're in the lead. So of course, like, you say you love technology, but obviously, you wish you could stop it. So all of those challenges.
Yeah, this echoes sort of the way I think I see payments in the way it's evolved across countries, which is a lot of the more emerging markets have been much quicker to adopt new payment technologies because the existing infrastructure was not either very well set there before. The existing players were not, strictly protecting their incumbent legacies and the like. So moving big institutions to better technologies is incredibly difficult. And it's interesting the way that Ripple has managed to move them along, to develop the network and to get them to join it. So that's, I think, one of the great successes. Can you talk a little bit about the XRP, sort of the role of the XRP ledger, the proof of consensus, and how that all works a little bit in this? What's the role of the XRP rather than just linking all the banks through a modern technology version of SWIFT, say, with message?
I absolutely agree with your observations. I think, and it's something to look at. It's like countries that skip landlines are a good example. Yeah. And also look at companies that are really companies that are challenging larger companies that have spent large amounts of money on capabilities. A good example is when you look at a company like Western Union that spent a huge amount of money optimizing their treasury functions, and companies that want to compete with them, they're saying, we don't want to spend that huge amount of, like, we would love to have the capability they have, but they spent huge amounts of money to build it. Can these newer technologies give us comparable capabilities at much lower cost? And then the nice thing about those is that the technology doesn't have to be as good. Sorry, my dog's
agreeing, I think the dog's agreeing. So
yeah. So let me talk about what makes the XRP ledger different. I think the biggest thing that's different is is that consensus algorithm. I mean, Bitcoin was a massively disruptive innovation, and it aims right at that settlement piece. So you can have all of the messaging in the world, but at some point, it's a distinction between payment and settlement. So like when I pay a bill with my credit card, I owe the credit card company money, and the credit card company owes the merchant, the restaurant money, but the money hasn't actually moved yet. And you can improve the payment aspect all of you want. If the settlement still stinks, then the whole experience for the customer and for the end user is still going to stink, because you can sort of hide it, but ultimately when you try to hide like inefficiencies and low layers, it will always come back to bite you. And I think that's one of the problems one of the problems. And so the main insight in Bitcoin, I think there's two. One of them was this: have a settlement asset that's universal, that has a fixed supply, that's jurisdictionally neutral. I think that was a huge innovation. And the way that they did it is, I think a lot of people don't realize, but the crux of what Bitcoin's innovation was that all of the rules of Bitcoin are enforced by all of the participants in the Bitcoin ecosystem. The state is public, the transactions are public, the rules are public. And so if you want to convince me that you paid me a Bitcoin, you can't just like show me someplace where it says I have a balance of 1 Bitcoin. You have to prove to me that you complied with all of the system's rules. And that makes a system that doesn't require a single trusted entity. Now, where that gets ugly is the double spend problem. That's the one problem that you can't solve just by saying everybody who uses the system enforces every rule, and that's the end of it. The double spend problem. If I can send the Bitcoin to Alice and I can send the Bitcoin to Bob, I can create both transactions. They're both equally valid. They're both equally good. The insight that I think we had was that's the only problem that you have to solve with some sort of a consensus algorithm, the problem of moving forward in 2 equally good ways. And I think what we realized with proof of work is that proof of work creates another set of stakeholders. Miners are stakeholders, right? Their interests are often averse to the interests of the people who just want to use the system. Miners may like a low transaction rate because that makes transactions scarce, which increases transaction fees, which their revenue is based on. And it's kind of ironic that the pitch in Bitcoin was be your own bank and no intermediaries, but miners are stakeholders in the ecosystem. They want, they have interests, and their interests are not the same as the interests of the people who are using the system. And I think one of the biggest problems, like as I mentioned before, our naive early vision was, well, everybody could mine. Anyone who had extra power, could mine. We know that that's completely unrealistic. It's become a completely centralizing force. What's going to happen is whoever has the cheapest power is going to look like whoever else has the cheapest power. Whoever has the best ASICs is going to look like everybody else who has the best ASICs. And so that's created a set of stakeholders that are not consistent with the be your own bank, no intermediaries narrative, and you can't exclude them from the system. The XRP ledger uses its consensus algorithm only for tie breaking, and that's it. That's the only case where you need it, because if one way of making forward progress is better than another way, every honest participant will prefer the way that's better per the system rules. The only problem that you can't solve that way is if I send 1 unit of XRP to Alice and 1 unit of XRP to Bob, those are equally good. There's no objective sense in which one of those transactions is better than the other. So clearly executing one of those transactions is better than executing neither of them. And executing both of them is worse than executing either one of them. Both or neither is better than executing both. But I mean, like those are objective rules that every participant can agree on. You don't need a consensus algorithm for things that are. Bitcoin doesn't need a consensus to know which transactions are valid, right? There's rules for that. So it only uses its consensus algorithm for tie breaking, and so there's no aversion. Like if you're mining, I don't want you to mine because if I'm mining, I make less money if you're mining. But there's nothing averse. It's a completely cooperative tie-breaking system. And so that brings both the cost down and that brings the speed up. Bitcoin's design gives that tie-breaking power essentially to whoever wastes the most energy. And there's probably 4 parties that control, about 60% of the hash rate, maybe more. A similar problem with Ethereum. The XRP ledger doesn't have that. And so the hope is, and I think to some extent, like the evidence has shown this, that like it's a system that's really built for the people who are using the digital asset. And the other interesting thing is, I just for a second to talk about proof of stake. Proof of stake doesn't create miners as stakeholders, but what it does mean is the people who hold the cryptocurrency or the asset are stakeholders. And those are not necessarily the people who are using it. If you think about a company like Western Union or MoneyGram, they move a lot of money. they're really using money pipeline systems more than almost anybody else. But they don't hold a whole, like their whole thing is we don't want to hold any more money than we absolutely have to because holding money is expensive and inefficient. So if the stakeholders are the people who are holding money, that's not the same as the people who benefit from a payment system. The people who benefit from a payment system are people who are moving money. They're not necessarily, so proof of stake, really, if you're a person who wants to use a system for payments, proof of stake gives you another set of four stakeholders, the people who hold the digital asset as an investment, who want fees from you for you using the system. The XRP ledger and XRP are unique in that the only stakeholders really are the people who are using the system to transact. There aren't a set of four stakeholders who have interest to averse that. Now the question is that going to make a difference? I think one way that it has is that the fees have remained very low and the transaction speed has remained very high, which is exactly what people who are using the system for payments would want. So I think I think that kind of sort of validates the idea that designing the system around the payment users being stakeholders produces a system that's better for payments.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I guess let me ask there's a sense in which one could use money for this, but in some sense, holding money is inefficient. And so that maybe I see a little bit. Am I right to think of the XRP ledger as a way to avoid holding money?
Yeah, I think that's big. I think when people look at the costs of payment systems, they don't necessarily look at the costs of holding money. And one of the things that we heard, I think we heard this first from Seagate as it happened. I don't know why, I don't remember how or why we were talking to Seagate, but Seagate has suppliers all around the world. And they are a company that has a very high cost of capital. They would really, really not like to be holding money. And they basically told us that they have a giant pile of money in Thailand because they have vendors in Thailand and they get really good deals from them if they pay them very, very quickly. And they don't necessarily know ahead of time, like they have a huge capital management office that makes sure that they don't keep they have to have enough money in Thailand to meet their agreements with their vendors, but they also don't want to have any more money there because they have a high cost of capital. And so they've spent this enormous, it's funny that it's like they say, well, the expense of that isn't that high. It's like, well, the reason the expense of that isn't that high is because you're spending a huge amount of money making the expense not high. Like if you consider your treasury management operations people as part of your expense, it's like you're holding those costs down, but only because of this of heroic efforts. And certainly if you consider like the total cost, not just of leaving the capital idle, but also the costs of figuring out how to minimize the amount of idle capital. And it's kind of funny. We were thinking like U.S. like we didn't target the U.S. to euro settlement market because it's so efficient. Companies like J.P. Morgan Chase has spent $5 billion building super efficient pipelines. The amount of money that moves is enormous, and we thought we'll never be able to be better than that because we're a new technology. There's all kinds of inefficiencies. We have to target like USD to MXN because that's such a terrible, but like if we couldn't beat that, then we're wasting our time, right? That's so inefficient. The asset is so volatile. You have to place the money there on Monday, on Friday to have money for Monday, and you run risk over the weekend. We thought that was the target market. There's no reason for us to target USD to euro. And I was shocked when we had customers that said, can you do USD to euro for us? And I said, why? That's so efficient. And they said, well, the problem is it's efficient, but it's not 24 hours a day. And we have holidays. And if a holiday falls at the end of a quarter or the end of a year, and like these things are not that common. For the common case, it works well. But we want to provide, we don't want to have to tell a customer, well, you kind of fell into a hole. Like, yeah, normally we can provide you great service, but this was the day before Christmas and getting the money there. Like it was weird to me that even where the existing systems were efficient, they had these problems that that enable people to still be interested in having the cryptocurrency system that's built to be 24/7, it's high availability, but very immature. I think that the sticking point is that it's very immature. That's, I think, the sticking point. We would love to have companies rely entirely on cryptocurrency infrastructure, but it's very hard to guarantee performance and availability today. I think enterprise readiness is something that we've spent probably 5 years as a major focus of saying, how can we take these technologies that work great for consumers most of the time? Like Bitcoin blockchain sometimes doesn't produce a block for an hour. Happens, bad luck. How do you build systems that hide that? And one of the annoying things is like 10% of the problem is when everything works fine. 90% of the problem is all the weird things that can go wrong. And sort of building that enterprise focus, I think, is something that it takes a company with, a number of engineers who know what they're doing. It was very audacious for us in the early days. We're going to build the software that goes right into the bank's transaction processing system. But I think what we realize now is that that's a fantastic asset to have your software right in the transaction processing system where real money moves.
Yeah, that's great. So in some ways, a huge entity like JP Morgan Chase has all the much more regulatory, much more scope advantage, you think, but all of that maybe comes with some disadvantage, that they have many purposes and many ways of thinking and systems within the bank that they need to talk to each other and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I would say their biggest handicap is the fact that they have to do everything. If you're going to use Chase to do something, Chase has to have the money in, it has to have the pipeline, it has to have the money out. If you build a system that's based on sort of neutral protocols and public blockchains that are open to the public, you can pick and choose what individual companies can do well. And that's the way to compete against a juggernaut that can do everything.
That's a great insight. That's really neat. In some ways now, Ripple is a big technology firm. It's been around for a while. So what I understand, you have an innovative arm that's RippleX in there that's looking forward. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where you see things going and some of the future ideas you guys are thinking about?
Yeah, so RippleX is sort of the other half of the company that's not doing the enterprise payment system. And our goal is to accelerate the Internet of Value, that idea that payment will be as easy as an email, and from a sort of ground up sort of approach, rather than the sort of improve it from the enterprise. There's sort of that bottom up approach where you build the technology, you open source it, you build a community, and there's sort of that top down. You build an enterprise payment network, you go after banks, and you expect that sort of the advantages will trickle down to people. Whereas in the other case, they sort of build up to the point where you get these tipping points and network effects. And so RippleX is kind of that bottom up part of a larger XRP community building on the XRP ledger. There's a lot of projects that RippleX is working on, including things like work in non-fungible tokens, federated sidechains, and CBDC. I'll go a little bit into detail I'll go into a little bit of detail on those because I think they're interesting. So one of them is NFTs have captured a lot of people's interest, but of course there's also a lot of pushback that ultimately it's like, what are these things actually good for? And really what the marketplace has settled on for now, I think, is collectibles. And I think there's an argument that makes sense only because a collectible doesn't have to do anything but exist really and be scarce. And of course, NFTs can exist and be scarce. So if that's all you need for a collectible, you got it. But that's not very interesting. What I think is interesting is thinking of NFTs as digital content licenses. So we all have digital content licenses. Like we have movies that we've purchased for view. We have books on Kindle. We have songs. If you think of NFTs as sort of a portable digital license that you can take with you and manage, rather than right now I have movies that I've purchased on Hulu, but if I drop my Hulu subscription, I lose those movies. So there's this idea of portable digital content licenses. I think the other interesting technology is federated sidechains, which is this idea of being able to easily create new blockchains so that you don't run into the scalability problem. Bitcoin has a scalability problem, but if you could easily build new blockchains on which Bitcoin could move, that would solve that. And I think the most interesting one is use of federated sidechains is central bank digital currencies. And I will say one thing, which is a lot of people think that CBDCs will sort of tighten government control over the movement of money, but I think it's actually exactly the opposite, because the vast majority of government control over the movement of money is indirect. It's not that the government stops you from moving money, it's that your bank account gets closed. It's that, and you have no appeal, right? Nobody's charging you with any crime. There's no due process. They don't even have to tell you. They just say, hey, you're not going to, because businesses often can't even open bank accounts because the bank says, hey, it's too much risk here. We're just not going to let you open an account. The way regulation rears its ugly head for people is indirectly through people other than regulators. If CBDCs replace this indirect regulation with direct regulation, where the government has to actually say no, that's a much better situation, because when the government says no, they have to give you a reason, and you can challenge that reason, and you can push on legislators. And so if we can replace this sort of soft indirect regulation where every bank just says no and you can't get access and you have no appeal and lots of people will tell you that they've had this experience where they need some financial product and literally every bank says no. And it's like, oh, well, I guess I just can't do that then. Marijuana dispensaries are a good example. But even if you're familiar with Operation Choke Point, where the United States government government decided that it would cut off financial access to completely legal businesses that were just disfavored, legal porn, firearms companies. Just, I mean, if we're going to make those things illegal, that's fine. We can do that. We're a democracy. If we want to ban porn, we want to ban firearms, we can do that. But what we should not do is not ban them and have an effective, indirect, unappealable shadow ban that comes from regulators saying to banks, this looks suspicious to us, and where the ultimate victim has no appeal. So CBDCs replacing indirect regulation with direct regulation could actually be a liberating force. And of course, it doesn't threaten legitimate sanctions against things like money laundering and human trafficking, and of course, invading your neighbor.
Yeah. Okay. That's. I mean, the KY, the know your customer, and all of that. It's an interesting aspect of the central bank digital currency, is that the Fed would then be in the position of having to enforce all those know your customer laws rather than just leaning on banks to do it. But in some sense, a clear, transparent set of rules and regulations is better than the discretion of the regulator or the enforcer. Although, I mean, you see that in many situations, clear laws still get enforced with some discretion. Let me switch to but I fundamentally agree with you that at the moment the regulatory scope, the amount of regulation the banking sector has to deal with, and the opacity with which it's enforced is sometimes very frustrating. And incumbent protecting, let's say.
Yes.
Let's go on. Let me take a couple of questions from the chat. So we have one question here, which is sort of whether stable coins as part of and maybe I'll throw in central bank digital currency are a direct competitor to XRP, whether XRP is essentially one of those. That's one of the questions coming in from the chat. Like, why is it not is it a stable coin? How does it differ? Because the advantage of the stable coins are an attempt to basically make payment by fixing it, making it $1 that is worth always $1. Always is too strong, but right. How does that space, or how does XRP, how does Ripple see that space?
I think to some extent it's a competitor in the sense that there are some applications where you might want to use a stable coin and some applications where you might want to use a cryptocurrency. And there might be some where you would take whichever one was best for your application. But I want to do a little bit of a frame challenge, and then I will answer the question. But my frame challenge is, I think competitors are very, very good. I think we're in a position where we desperately need them. And I'll give you an analogy, and then I'll explain why the analogy is relevant. So if you think about if Twitter was the only internet service, nobody would have home internet access, nobody would have cell phones, and Twitter would have no market. Twitter exists because people find value in the ecosystem that Twitter is a part of. And Twitter's customers are people who have phones, smartphones, people who have home internet access, people who can access Twitter because they find that whole ecosystem valuable. If we tried to force customers to use XRP where it wasn't the best solution to their problem, we just wouldn't have customers. And so what we're focused on, like from a strategic point of view, is healthy competitors and customers not locked in to any particular technology, even the ones we favor. It would actually be to our disadvantage. Like, let's say Bitcoin was better than XRP for some applications. Like, go use Bitcoin, please. Get the best possible experience so that you like the system. Just don't lock out and don't lock yourself into one technology so that you can't use a different one if it's actually better for your application. So, but of course the question is like, well, what if it's, is a stable coin better than XRP for everything? I think not, for a couple of reasons. So one of them is a stable coin is generally going to be pegged to some asset, let's say the dollar. It's not going to be a sort of geopolitically neutral asset, at least not in the foreseeable future. Also, it's going to have some sort of counterparty that's going to sort of regulate and run it. And that's fine for the people who are who are in with that regulator. So for example, if you're doing anything with dollars, your exposure to the Fed is already infinite. So if the Fed's going to issue a dollar stable coin, those are dollars. I mean, there's no more real dollar than the Fed owing you a dollar. That's a dollar for all practical purposes, but it's a dollar. It's not a euro. It's not, it's not any other asset. So I do think there's a role for stable coins. Number one, is a way of holding money and as a way of keeping piles of money for deployment, but you're still going to need liquidity between them. And I still think that there's a huge market for a sort of liquidity focusing token that isn't tied to a particular jurisdiction. And I think also there will be a room for assets that have a sort of stable supply. And I think that sort of stable supply if you're holding a large amount of an asset, you don't necessarily, inflation is the thing that you're sort of fighting against. And I think the digital asset ultimately, as it sort of stabilizes a little more, will be able to keep pace with inflation in ways that a stable coin won't. But I think another factor, though, is like what happens to the sort of global inflation index. So right now, it's kind of hard to actually even make a stable coin because if interest rates are negative, you almost can't even do it. As interest rates get higher, it'll be very profitable to be in the stablecoin business, but less profitable to hold and use stablecoins. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic. If inflation goes up, you're going to really want to be a stablecoin issuer because you're going to be sitting on a huge pile of fiat currency with nobody expects interest in a stablecoin, right? It's just enough they can hold it, but then people won't want to hold it. It'll become a hot potato asset. So I think if the argument is that a stablecoin is stable and super efficient, and so that makes it great, then all you need is a couple of chinks in that, because the argument is essentially a perfection argument. It's so perfect, why would you use anything else? Well, it's really not perfect because there's a counterparty, there's a jurisdiction, there's inflation, and if inflation is low, it's going to be expensive to exist. And if inflation is high, people aren't going to want to hold it, but the issuers will make money. So it's not a perfect solution either. I think having a large number of solutions will inspire people to improve payment systems so that they can, like right now, people couldn't use either of these because they were using payment systems like Swift that can't settle. So I think having a suite of options that people like will inspire people to join the ecosystem of people who could use a digital asset to settle, could use a stable coin. And then it's on each of those ecosystems to compete to give customers the best solutions. And then customers will get the best experience because they'll have that freedom of choice of what works best for their particular problem.
So I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, which is coming. It's rather specific, but I think it's an interesting one. So is Hyperledger an effective platform upon which to build a central bank digital currency? Do you have opinions on that?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine. I think the characteristics that you need for a platform to build a central bank digital currency is you need a platform where you can enforce the type of security model that blockchains have. I think that's the critical thing. Like, why doesn't the Fed just give everybody access to FedWire? It's because FedWire's security model is based on you having 24/7 cyber response, and it's based on you having system audits, and it's based on every participant being secure. That doesn't work. The most critical thing to make a CBDC work is a security model that can tolerate opening the system to the world. And blockchain. So any blockchain will solve that problem. Now, that doesn't mean they're all equally good from that point on, but I think that critical thing is that you need a security model that, if you could break the Bitcoin blockchain, you could make $1 billion. If you could break the XRP ledger, you could make $1 billion. If you could break Ethereum, you could make, $1 billion. These systems are wide open to the world. And of course, no corporation would ever make a system like that was open to the world like that. It's insane. So the must have is the security model. I think the critical thing for CBDCs to be interesting, though, is interoperability. So if the United States is going to build a CBDC around dollars, and Europe is going to build a CBDC around the euro, and India is going to build a CBDC, and Saudi Arabia is going to build one, if these things don't interoperate at all, then why did we, like, that interesting thing was what I was talking about before, was every financial institution being able to settle with every other financial institution, every asset. So that's going to mean that a US financial institution is going to have to be able to make a euro payment and hold a euro balance. Otherwise, it's not interesting. And so so obviously the CBDC platform that my company's been building provides that level of security, but also like it's core to that interoperability. And the other thing I think is very interesting is it will provide direct interoperability with digital assets like XRP and Bitcoin. Now, I don't think institutions, particularly governments, will enable that in the beginning. But, you build people a walled garden and you give them a big red button that says like push button to knock down walls. And the hope is that after a while, what they'll realize is by keeping those walls up, they're just enabling middlemen to profit and they're producing a worse experience for their customers. So like if I need liquidity between, USD and the euro, and it's just right there, but the system is just not allowing it. At some point, what will happen is people will monetize their ability to be inside and outside the wall, and that competition will bring that cost down. But eventually, the hope is that these system operators will make these systems more open, and we will really have international settlement that works like email. That's like the ultimate vision. But that's going to that's going to require a lot of things to change.
Julia, do we have time for another question, or are we supposed to be wrapping up? I have a couple more here.
Yes, we can. Just another question or two.
Okay. I guess there's concern. So let me actually turn back to one of the things we thought about before. So I think we're maybe in the same place. Can you talk just a little bit about, so I think we may share the same frustration with Bitcoin about just how much electricity it burns and how bad for the environment it is.
Yeah.
And I've sort of had a pet hobby of thinking about ways to bring down proof of work cryptocurrencies. I don't know if we can have a discussion about that, but it would be nice to get rid of them all. I'm very happy that Ethereum is sort of switching the ways it's going to run things. And is that possible for Bitcoin? Is it possible just to get rid of Bitcoin? Where are we in that space of like advancing an ESG goal of getting rid of the electricity burning to clear payments?
Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating. I think there's sort of, I think there's a sort of a history of people who develop software and systems like that not thinking about the environmental factors because they're so removed from them. But even like when you write software, small changes in the way software is designed, particularly if that software winds up widely deployed, can have significant impact on the electric consumption. But when have you heard of a computer programmer, like, I'm trying to reduce the memory consumption, I'm trying to reduce the CPU consumption? Well, who works on the energy consumption of software? And normally it's not that terribly big a deal because you don't have something like proof of work where the money is directly tied to the energy consumption. So one possibility would be that more environmentally friendly mechanisms like what Ethereum is transitioning to, like what the XRP ledger do, just gradually displace Bitcoin because the cost of the proof of work is so high. Bitcoin has to produce millions of dollars a day in value just to pay for the mining, just to keep the blockchain secure and hold the price constant. That turns into high transaction fees. So what's happened is people have sort of had to argue that that is the secret sauce of a blockchain. And I think all of the competing blockchains that don't use proof of work are kind of the evidence that the proof of work is not the secret sauce. It's the censorship resistance, it's the decentralization, it's the every participant can enforce every rule. So I think we have some convincing to do. We have to convince people. And unfortunately, part of the problem is it's hard to convince somebody of something when their livelihood depends on them not being convinced of it. The miners are real stakeholders. They're making a lot of money. And as blockchain adoption grows across the global financial system, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, for our planet and for the global economy. Fundamentally, a competitive system with financial rewards is going to consume resources equal to its rewards. If I offer someone $10 to do something and it costs much less than $10 to do it, lots of people will do it, right? And they'll bid the costs up and they'll increase the competitive. Mining is perfectly competitive, and so its resource consumption will increase until it yields virtually no value. We're all running on a hamster wheel. We're all getting nowhere. I just hope that we can convince people that proof of work provides at best adequate security. It provides extremely high cost. It's extremely expensive, both in the environment and in dollars. But ultimately, I think if the Bitcoin stakeholders insist that they're not going to abandon proof of work and not transition to something else, I guess we just have to hope that it withers and dies. I mean, at some point they will. I think they're going to face a choice. I think at some point, like all institutional adopters, bulk holders are going to say, like, you either need to do something about this, or we're just going to move to other technologies, or those other technologies will just win in the market. One of the things that kind of helps with that is that any reduction in value significantly reduces the security of the system. And so I hope, but unfortunately, I mean, to be brutally honest, I do think there's room for one proof of work system competing. And so I don't think that natural competitive forces alone will it may drive out every other proof of work system, but I don't think competitive forces alone. People are going to have to take a moral stance, a principled stance, or it won't or I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to a place where all mining occurs geothermally in Iceland, where electricity is cheap and you can't really ship it out too easily. So perhaps we can hope for minimal green disruption on that front.
But then the question is that decentralized? Is that decentralization?
That's not particular.
That almost puts the finger on.
Yeah, how many entities are there working? But it's all in Iceland's hands.
But at least it's better for the planet. So I'm not.
Yeah, much better for the planet. So anyway, David, this has been a complete pleasure. I'm going to turn it back over to Julia, who I think is telling us time is up. But this has just been great. Thank you very, very much for doing this. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you, Jonathan. I had a blast, and thanks to MIT for hosting us.
Thank you so much for being here, both of you. And David, thank you so much, especially for all of your great thoughts and definitely some great content there that leads us into the ESG panel that we'll be having later today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So just a quick logistics note as well. It's time for lunch for all the attendees, which will be served right outside the rooms. And also there's a startup competition coming up next. So look out for that. Thank you, David. Thank you so much, Professor Parker, for being here with us. Have a great day.
Hi everyone, I'm going to briefly talk about the NFTs, because as you know, we have created an NFT collection that we're going to airdrop to a bunch of you who are interested. I'm trying to get them up on the screen, hopefully, a few of them so you can see them. Basically, the story is we got a